Tonight, we welcome Wes Messenger, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Willamette Valley Project Botanist, for our April 2017 Science Pub presentation entitled Biodiversity of Western Oregon Native Bees. Everybody's worried about the bees, and with good reason. In this presentation, Wes will explain some of the diversity we stand to lose with a focus on Oregon native bees. How many kinds are there? How do they live their lives? Red, black, yellow, or metallic, social or solitary, worker or parasite, abundant or nearly extinct, fighting over mouse holes or wrapping their babies in leaves. Native bee variety is astounding. A biologist by inclination, upbringing, and training, Wes earned his Bachelor's of Science and Master's from Oregon State University, where he concentrated on plant ecology and evolution. He studied and managed native habitats, rare plants, and rare butterflies in Oregon for some decades. Mr. Wessinger, I'm sorry, cares for land and organisms associated with the dams in the Willamette Valley watershed. Working with plants for so long naturally led to an interest in their insect associates. Working with plants, you could ask me about pre-dispersal seed predators or gall midges, but these days he is getting the most fun out of pollinators, especially bees. And with that, we welcome Wes. Woohoo!
All right, hey, glad you're all here. Bees. Does that sound okay? Bees. I think bees are one of the few animals whose name is onomatopoeia. Bees. Okay, that works. So I do work for this Corps of Engineers thing. A lot of the knowledge I'm going to talk about tonight I got on my own through pure interest. But that said, knowledge of organisms, including pollinators, is needed for the core environmental mission, and so I'm going to do one little official thing about that before we move on. So our regulations say do this thing, maintain healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, leave it as good or better than you found it. And so biodiversity includes bees, and here we'll move directly on from that little bit of official stuff to the good part. So here is a little spring andrena. I spent some andrena bee, a little spring bee that digs burrows. I want to say that all the pictures that you're going to see of the bugs today are either in the public domain or in the Creative Commons license. And I took some trouble to make sure all the pictures you're going to see are species that you can be seen or have a record from Oregon. So, well, we're going to talk about bees mostly, but of course you can't really think about bees very well without thinking about pollination. Pollination is necessary for plants, to reproduce, because they have this trouble getting the male sex cell together with the female sex cell because they're rooted in the ground. And, that's not so much trouble for mammals like you and me. Mostly getting the sex cells together for mammals is a social problem, right? But for plants, it's a physical problem because they're apart and they need something to move that male sex cell to the female sex cell. It would be kind of like if you wanted babies and you had to take a possum to bed. Is that too weird? Okay. Yep. Too weird. Oh. How about a raccoon? Anybody? Raccoon? Okay, the best pollinators in the world, of course. Bees. Why are they the best pollinators in the world? The answer to that question has to do with what a bee actually is. So what's a bee? A bee is a very cute and cuddly stinging wasp who raises its babies almost entirely on pollen. So they're flower-visiting descendants of the stinging wasps. And this, the stinging wasps include the ants and the hornets that we don't like. Sometimes we call them bees, but they're not. The reason they're good at pollination is because they're built to move pollen, and in fact, they're made of pollen. And we'll see why pretty soon. This little common halictus sweat bee, covered with pollen, is crawling around looking for her burrow right now. Now, what's not a bee? Anything that you see with visiting a flower and has some yellow and black stripes is not a bee. For example, this little hoverfly or syrphid has only 2 wings, not 4. Even though he or she is visiting a flower, may do some pollination, even though really it's there to drink sugar water. Not a bee. And the critters we spoke of earlier that ruin your picnic, they can visit flowers as well. Yellow and black stripes. Hornets, not bees. So you may take your bebop out, but you're really bopping hornets. You're really scared of hornets, not bees. Oh, and what's not a native bee? If it lives in a hive, if it makes a lot of honey, if it has a queen that's obviously different than the rest of the hive, if the colony lives for more than a single year, it's not a native bee. It's a honeybee. It's livestock. It's a farm animal. It was brought here by humans from Eurasia for human purposes. That doesn't devalue it per se. I mean, I like hamburger, chicken and eggs, honey. I like the things that farm animals bring us, but honeybees are not native bees. Okay, quick review of classification hierarchy. Kingdom animals, phylum arthropods, they're with the crabs and scorpions, all that great stuff. Order Insecta, that's all the six-legged, almost all the six-legged critters. The class is Hymenoptera, and that's all the wasps, hornets, ants, and bees. The subclass is Apoidea, which is a fake taxon that includes the bees. There are several families we'll get to. There are a lot of genera. This is a book that includes all the genera in the world. And the next one over includes the genera of North America and Mexico. And the species, how many? So many. So many species. So we have fossil bees from the Eocene in amber, Baltic amber, Dominican amber. Fossil bees from the Eocene are maybe 40, maybe 50 million years old. By the time we get fossil bees in amber, all the modern groups are there. We can identify genera, we can easily identify families. Somehow, by 65 million years ago, most of the larger bee groups that we know about and think about were there. So that fossil bees in amber don't help us understand where bees came from, how they evolved very well. Thank goodness there's DNA and supercomputers and a lot of smart guys with mathematical models. So what I want you to see here is not every little line, but if you see the broad colors, you're looking at bee families. The blue and the red colors. If you see the thicker bars that are on, this is a family tree, by the way. You're really looking at the way bees evolved in terms of essentially a family tree or the key part of this is the timing. Using fancy math, they figured out that bees radiated from their common ancestor more like 123 million years ago. Coincidentally, that's about when flowering plants started getting more diverse. They came up on the scene and started radiating. So the folks that wrote this paper pretty much proved that the crown bees, the great diversity of modern bees, radiated or evolved exactly when flowering plants did. So not only are they made of pollen, they evolved in concert with all the plants that produce pollen. So to simplify the family tree a little bit, here are the major families we'll talk about tonight. Remember this hierarchy: families, genera, species. Now, we'll talk about the Apidae, the Megachilidae, the Andrenidae, the Halictidae, not the Stenotridae, and then the Coletidae. Those are all families that can be found in Oregon. They're all worldwide, and they're all ancient. We're talking 120 million years. So that kind of, the kind of diversity we're talking about within Oregon took that long to evolve and has been around for that long, which I think is pretty awesome. So I wanted to stop here. A lot of the photos we'll see don't show scale very well because they're designed to fill the frame. We want to fill up your eyeballs with really cuddly, darling bees. So I wanted to show this to just show the range of sizes. And this is taken from a display that you can see at Big Stewart Park now, or on the Mother's Day weekend if you come up to the wildflower event. Oh, and it looks like my California carpenter bee has flown off, but you get the idea. We're really, we're really talking about an inch or so down to a couple 3 millimeters in size. That's the kind of diversity of size that we're talking about. Within Oregon bees, we don't have the Megachile Pluto, but we have bees that are pretty dang close to that size in the large carpenter bees and the bumblebees. So we're going to talk about Apidae first, mainly because they're really, a lot of us are most familiar with those. Just little bombus on a native buckwheat or Eriogonum up by Fairview. There are about a dozen species of bumblebee in the Willamette Valley. We'll look at several of them here. I'm going to also talk about a little bit about life cycle and ecology, physiology, and such things as that before moving on to the other families. So Bombus bifarius, pretty bumblebee, pretty cuddly, right? Really fuzzy. Don't you want to love her? Bombus nevadensis is probably the biggest bumblebee on the valley floor. She's working hard at some horse mint, it looks like right here. Bombus fosdesinsky, we have a common name, that's the yellow-faced bee. Most of the bees I see around my yard near Cottage Grove, most of the bees we see on the valley floor are probably either this one or maybe not this one. It's probably this one. And we'll see why it might be hard to tell here in a sec. Bombus mixtus. She's got a little bit of orange on her. And Bombus melanopygus, which translated means the black-butted bumblebee, which is a literal, pretty nicely literal for a Latin name. All these can be found here in the valley. So this is Bombus bifarius again, male and a female. You can see the males and females look a little bit different, or a lot different. I'm going to talk about the bumblebee life cycle here because, bumblebees have it hard. There's a whole book called Bumblebee Economics that really you should read first. And lays out essentially the energy flow and the effort it takes to be a queen bumblebee and make a new queen bumblebee for the following year. And that's where the life cycle comes in. And the trivia question, how long do bumblebees live, bumblebee queens live, is 1 year. A bumblebee nest or hive will make queen bumblebees at the end of the summer or in the fall. And they make male bumblebees at the same time. The queen flies off, mates, and the males all croak. It's a short but hopefully good life. No possums. The queens then live through the winter by themselves. They keg up somewhere in some pine needles under the duff of some Douglas fir. Maybe they find a hole. And they basically sleep through the winter, which in the far Arctic is quite a deal. And there are bumblebees in the far Arctic that live on the tiny Arctic willows. Around here, I've slept outside in the winter in my jacket when I didn't plan to, but not all winter. That's what she does. And I want to emphasize here, of all the bees, only the females collect pollen. Only the females rear the young, build the rations for the young to live on, and if there's rearing done, only the females do that. Males buzz around, drink sugar water out of flowers, mate, croak. That's what they're good for. Soda pop and cruising for chicks. So what does she do when she wakes up in the spring? Mated, she's already mated, so she has fertilized eggs and unfertilized eggs. You'll get the answer to this pretty quick. She flies around and looks for some flowers, collects some pollen, finds an abandoned mouse burrow, starts building wax cups inside the abandoned mouse burrow. Sometimes they fight to the death to take possession of the mouse burrow. Build some wax cups in the abandoned mouse burrow and start filling those wax cups with pollen and a little bit of nectar to make a ration. On each wax cup gets 1 egg. She builds some number of those. It depends really. It depends on the species, how many workers there end up being, how big the nest ends up being. But when those workers are raised, she stops working on flowers and stays working in the hive or in the nest the whole time. Because she did it by herself, a lot of times the first workers you see in spring are little bitty workers. They're females and they're extra small, but they have all the characteristics of the species. They're just small because they didn't get much to eat because mom was doing it all herself. So the workers start working the flowers and the queen stays in the hive and keeps the hive warm or cool. Yes, bumblebees are what you might call warm-blooded. They have this mechanism. They fly around a lot, but they have two mechanisms that help them keep warm or cold, depending on the situation. In the nest, they can actually flip a switch inside of their thorax and vibrate their wing muscles without vibrating their wings. It makes heat. Then they have a mechanism that can pump the heat into their abdomen so they can sit on their eggs like a hen would sit on her eggs and keep the nest and the eggs or the developing larvae the right temperature to keep developing. That's pretty much her whole job. And while they're flying, they can turn off that switch and keep the thorax and the wing muscles warm and let the abdomen cool off so they can fly in temperatures that might kill another insect because they're internally heated by the action of the wings and the heat pumps. So one thing to know about bumblebees is only they and the livestock bees have a queen that's obviously different from the workers or the males. And the difference and the reason that we consider the bumblebee sort of one notch down from the most social of bees is because the bumblebee hive only lasts a year. All those workers build up the hive strength to the extent that they can, and then at the end of the season they make a bunch of queens and males and they all croak. The queens and males go off and repeat the cycle. I'm back to the beginning where I started. Bumblebee hives are different sizes depending on the species, and I will say one of the biggest colony sizes of the bees in Western Oregon was the western bumblebee, or Bombus occidentalis. And I say was because sometime in the 90s, they went from the most common bee around here to almost zero in population. They're functionally extinct on the landscape throughout their former range. You can still find one or two. You read a scientific paper that says, yay, we found the western bumblebee. It's not extinct. Well, we found one. We found 0.023% of what we used to be able to find. It's functionally extinct. It doesn't function on the landscape or in the ecology in the way that it used to, especially on the coast where it was very important as a large hive bumblebee that could get an early start for pollination. So that's sad, and it's not on the list, but its sister species, the rusty patch, you've probably all heard back east, is on the list. So identifying bumblebees is fraught because of this cool thing that happens. When bumblebee species live together, they start looking like each other. It's a form of mimicry. It's like bumblebees and their co-occurring bumblebees. Essentially, if you're a bumblebee, you can sting the heck out of something. Nothing wants to get stung. But it has to learn. And so if there's twice as many things that look similar, that kind of mimicry, which is called Mullerian mimicry, that kind of mimicry protects the whole group. So in this shot, in this clip from a scientific paper, the top row is two different species. The bottom row is a third species that lives nearby. And you see the columns, the bottom species has come to resemble or mimic the top species. And you know, that's true of bumblebees throughout the world. Here's some color diagrams from England, the eastern United States, and the western United States that show the sort of mimicry rings or bumblebees coming to look like other bumblebees. In the lower right, you can see our black-faced, yellow-faced, a couple of things that could be the yellow-faced bumblebee, even in hand sometimes. Even if you measure the ratio of the length of the cheek and the width of the cheek, you can't always tell. So that's within a genus, there's a lot of mimicry. You're not cheering for the new species. I recommend every time I put a new species up, you cheer and take a drink. There's only 100 slides. Not a bumblebee. Okay, so same family, this apid family. This is, you know, I'm sorry, there's no common names for these things. So this is Anthophora bomboides, or the flower-loving, not a bumblebee that looks like a bumblebee, which in translation. And we'll see her again. She's a solitary bee, not a bumblebee. Now, okay, one thing about another kind of diversity we have among bees is the whether the bee specializes on one or a few kinds of flowers, or whether it's kind of very generalist. And there are a lot of patterns among bees in whether things are generalists. These longhorn bees, this is a Melisodes, or some people call them sunflower bees. The Melisodes often work just things that are in the sunflower family. Partly this may be because of seasonality. Sunflowers bloom late in a lot of the country, and the Melissodes come out late. Some species work only evening primroses. Most bees are pretty generalist, but you can imagine if there's a tight relationship between a flower and a bee, and you lose one or the other, there's going to be ecological problems. Another kind of specialty is back in the bumblebees, where a bumblebee, because it's such a hard life, and you've got to get that energy built into the next generation's queens, an individual bumblebee will specialize for a day. She'll learn, the worker will learn how to work a certain flower, like a lupin or a pea flower, which takes some effort and takes some thought to do, and they'll stick to that all day. Other bees in the same cohort will work other kinds of flowers. So that increases efficiency for the hive, and it's a kind of specialization. Daily, we learn how to do this the most efficient way. But beautiful, cuddly sunflower bees of several species. Another kind of diversity is the difference between male and female. There's always a difference. There are species out there that are only known from the male and only known from the female. They've never been able to figure out how they fit together. They don't use possums. But you can almost always tell a male because of the longer antennae, and they actually have an extra antennal segment. Does this help them find the girls? Probably. Another Melissodes, a common one around here. And you see a Melissodes sunflower bee on her sunflower family plant. Now, teddy bear bees. Yeah, I don't know if the common name should be teddy bear bee or cuddle bee. They're gray, they're fuzzy. The genus is Habropoda. And for some reason, a bunch of the species are named with sad Latin words. There's Habropoda depressa is the one that comes to my office and works the Oregon grape every year. Habropoda miserabilis. Habropoda triste, which means sad. And why? It just makes you want to cuddle them more, doesn't it? Okay, still in the Apidae, this family that includes our livestock and the bumblebees, we get carpenter bees. These are the large carpenter bees. They chew holes in wood, like in the post that holds your porch roof up and stuff. It makes some people think they're pests, but a porch roof, I think, is less important than a carpenter bee. You can always replace the posts. And they're the size of bumblebees. If you say, oh man, I've never seen a black bumblebee that's all black, carpenter bee, large carpenter bee. Here, it's amazing when I show this on a bee on fireweed. It's from my yard. One day, five bees, lots of diversity. You can wander around and see. It's amazing how many bees you can see. Okay, small carpenter bees are small. That's 4-point type. Okay, a point is 1/72 of an inch. These are millimeter end bees, but their closest relative is the large carpenter bee.
Wow.
Why?
Because evolution. All right, and nomada, also small. Those are millimeter marks. And nomada has a sinister secret that we'll go into later. Notice it's red. Told you there were red bees. Some are redder, or maybe this one faded in the collection. Nomada also, different species, small, black and white, sinister. All right, Megachilidae, we're moving down the family tree. Here are what we reasonably call the leafcutter bees.
Your mommy's welcome.
So leafcutter bees obviously nest with cut leaves, among other things. And there's some pretty different appearances amongst, this is a genus, Megachile, same genus as Megachile pluto from Indonesia, and they all cut leaves to some extent for their babies. And this is the famous blue orchard mason bee, same family. Nests in holes, but being a mason bee, it makes its nest with mud. There are quite a few other bees in this family. What they have in common is if they gather pollen, instead of gathering it on their hind legs or their hind and middle legs like most bees, they gather it on a brush of hair under their abdomen. And this, you can see the brush of hair on this Hyraeades on her abdomen, and also the really neat kind of puncture pattern. She has a really thick skull. Some of these smaller megachilid family bees don't use mud, but they then pick up tiny pebbles, and they close their nests with tiny pebbles. That's diversity. What's he doing? He's sleeping. He's sleeping. A lot of male bees in particular will just go off at night and grab onto something with their mandibles and go sleep. See, don't you want to cuddle them now? Yes. So these anthidiums and anthidiellums, they're still related to the megachile, the leafcutter bees. There's quite a bit of really cool differences in their looks. Some are really fuzzy. Oh. We're going to skip over the impaled bee in the collection and move on to, oh, Coleoxys. He's sleeping. Oh. Coleoxys has a sinister secret as well. What is the secret of the bees? Okay, next family, the Andrinas. You know, there's common names for some of these families, like the mining bees and the digger bees. I can't keep the diggers straight from the miners, so we're going to use Latin. We're going to stay with the Latin. Andrinas, a neat family. The genus Andrina comes out mostly in the spring, very early, as early as anything. Some of our very early spring flowers, they're important pollinators. They'll work, some work willows, some work the little baby blue eyes that we'll see later. But they have a kind of a diverse look to them all. The red-haired Andrina, Lupinorum. Somebody thought it was important for lupins. Of course, there's a bee called, there's a bee they thought was specialized on death camas that actually works. No, they thought it worked astragalus, which is the loco weed back on the east side, but it actually specializes on death camas. So the names can be misleading. Cerulean. You'll see a lot of cerulean in the valley, and you'll also, I will anyway, confuse it with a lot of other kind of blue-black Andrinas. And Nigraherta. So sizes, colors, hair colors, all that stuff, pretty different. Well, these are the sweat bees. You've probably heard of them, called sweat bees. They're a whole family, halictids, quite a bit of diversity in size, from almost as big as a honeybee to 3 or 4 millimeters. These are what I think of as the generic native bee. If you just walk out and say, yoo-hoo, native bee, it's probably a halictid, and it's probably either halictus or one of the big lasioglossums. This Halictus farinosus, same species here. Titus eye. But then, shiny wings and metallic, and really 3 to 4 millimeters long. These are hard to identify. DNA has been used recently to sort of break out the different species and then try to find something that you can see to differentiate them, that's the kind of scale we're thinking about. That thing is only crossing 2 or 3 little florets in a sunflower. So, and then your agapostamon. Whoa, yeah. This becomes pretty much the most common and obvious bee around here in the late summer. If you have asters in your yard, even ornamental asters, they'll be swarming it. And the reason is they build up big populations over the summer, and also they really catch the eye. That metallic green is awesome. Now, Calididae, I think most wouldn't catch your eye. They kind of look like, again, a fairly generic native bee. Calidius faciliae, you ladies and gentlemen, yay. We call them the cellophane bees. There's a lot of chemical diversity among different bee species. They're full of glands that secrete stuff. This lady lines her burrow nests with a secretion that dries like cellophane. It's plastic. Somebody said it was really a polyester. It makes the nest waterproof, saves the babies, and we'll see a drawing of that nest later. Hard to tell the difference. The great Bill Stevens, who recently passed away, the great bee biologist from Oregon State University, did his PhD on this group. To tell them apart, a lot of times you dissect out the male genitalia of the specimen and draw it very carefully. And that's where the diversity, at least in the male calidids are, and in many other species, which may have to do, maybe one of the reasons there's a shortage of bee taxonomists. There really is a shortage. And, it's a bee, it's a calidid. It's pretty, I can identify the genus, species, that we consider species the irreducible unit of biodiversity a lot of times. Identifying bees to species is not like birds. Anybody can learn all the birds. Butterflies? Bees, there may be no one alive that can identify all the bees in a given genus. But what a face! About the what? I'll find that pretty soon. So in the same family, this is a fuzzy face that you just want to tickle and cuddle, right? The yellow-faced bees, for a reason, they're called the yellow-faced bees. You can only see 3 of the 5 eyes right there. These are, again, a few millimeters long. So from a sort of average bee-sized bee to a few millimeters long in the same family, from the very fuzzy, typical bee-looking bee, pollen-gathering bee, to this little shiny, hard-bodied, yellow-faced bee. Same family, more related than bumblebees and the fuzzy bee we just saw. 7 species of yellow-faced bees in Hawaii are on the endangered species list. So that with Bombus aphidus, that adds up to 8 endangered species in the US. What happened there was some poor old yellow-faced bee got blown into Hawaii. Maybe she had already mated, and so she could lay eggs that were female if they were fertilized, male if they were unfertilized, and create a population of yellow-faced bees on an island. But then as Hawaii moved, the hotspot moved, and there got to be more islands, there was speciation. So Hylaeus, or yellow-faced bees in Hawaii, are super diverse. But like everything in Hawaii, invasive species like humans and pigs and malaria are driving things towards extinction. And of course, not all yellow-faced bees have yellow faces. Woohoo! So some of the really little, we're going to move on to some behavior stuff from the just plain taxonomy, family differences, genus differences, and morphology, what looks cool and different. Some of these little bees, like the yellow-faced bees, and this small carpenter bee. Do you guys know Aurelia? That's a bee on an Aurelia flower, so that gives you a sense of scale. It's little. It's so little. So a lot of these guys nest in the canes of dead canes of plants. So they'll make burrows in the pith of blackberries or elderberries, or I've seen them investigating the dead stems of checker mallows in my yard, or fireweed. So this is a good reason not to clean up your garden too good. Don't make it look pretty. Leave some stems for the bees, maybe 10 inches tall. So, and you can see the scale, small carpenter bees, 3 to a centimeter in terms of their eggs or larvae. They're small. Back to Megachile. It's a very typical looking leafcutter bee. Their nests can vary quite a bit. Now, in nature, they probably mostly nest in beetle holes in trees. But of course, their tendency to nest in any kind of burrow-looking or tube-looking thing has made it possible for humans to manage them. We can put tubes out in our yard and find them. But here we see the kind of difference in a big and a little bee and how they build their nests within those tubes. One fills it up tight, wraps it in leaves. The other leaves more spaces and more protection, gives more protection. Now, Osmia has even more, here's our blue orchard bee again. Tube nesting is pretty much the typical, like you see on the bottom here. That's what you expect. That's what you go down to the store and buy the little tubes for. But there's a lot of diversity in what Osmia will build its nests in, from natural cavities to there's some accounts of Osmia building nests in dried dung pats of ungulates on the prairies. That's pretty cool, but most bees, here's our bumblebee imitating flower lover, Anthophora bomboides again. Most bees dig holes in the ground to nest. Here's our cuddly teddy bear bee, Habropoda, and here somebody on the University of California, Berkeley campus found a colony of these and made casts of their nest holes. That's the shape of the burrow that this bee would make to lay its eggs in. But there's lots of shapes, potentially. Lots of branching patterns, from very little to very complicated. Each of the cells you see in these burrows will take one little lump of pollen and one egg and make one bee if everything goes well.
What do they dig with?
They're tiny, cute feet. Honestly, with mandibles and feet, they do an amazing bunch of stuff. They also smooth the edges with there's a little smooth plate right on the very last abdominal segment. So they tamp things down with their butts.
How deep are these?
Not many feet, decimeters. So I don't know how you spent the 60s, but Susan Batra spent the 60s watching bees. And she made little glass-plated habitats for them and actually recorded how they make their nests. And so from the top left, this is a time series of how one of those tiny little sweat bees that are a few millimeters long makes its nest over time. Now, it's interesting here because the little black dots that you can barely see are adults. They're all working the nest, they're all laying eggs, and they're all bringing pollen in to feed the babies. So this kind of is a good opportunity to talk about where is sociality in these native bees. We have The honeybee, which has the sort of highest level of social integration, where the hive lives year-round, year after year. If the hive splits, it's because there's a new queen. We have the bumblebees, where the hive only lives 1 year, but there's a queen and she looks different, which is the highest level of social integration in the native bees. Then we have a bunch of these sweat bees where maybe there's a queen. It's hard to tell. She doesn't look any different. Maybe her sisters or her daughters are mainly doing the work of gathering pollen and tending and digging, but not laying eggs. So there may be a queen in workers, but you'd have to be Susan Batra and spending your 60s this way to really know it. Then there are a lot of hives that are just communal, where they're related, but it's a sort of a free-for-all. There's a burrow system that looks a lot like this, but many bees that are maybe related and may not be are making cells at the same time. The entrance to the nests can be different. This is one genus, and the different ways they make their nest entrance are tumuli, from little turrets to little mounds. That's biodiversity. One of my favorite things to think about is the shape of the pollen mass. Okay, we learned that bees are made of pollen. They only eat pollen. The larvae go from egg to adult on pollen, just moistened with a little nectar to keep it into a certain shape. Here's a few of the different shapes that pollen mass can be underground. I really like the one in the center that's a tripod, or the one in the top center that is a mushroom. But the flying saucers are cool too. Why do they do this? Well, if you had some high protein, high sugar stuff and you were burying it in the ground, what do you think would happen to it? It would mold. So the less contact it has with the ground, the less likely it is to mold, and the more likely it is that your babies will make it. It helps that you're lining the nest with something that's antibacterial, antifungal, like cellophane, highly chemically altered cellophane from the cellophane bees or Calides that I mentioned before. And then there's Andrena, our spring burrowing bees. On the right, the diagram shows where it puts its egg on a normal day, and the diagram on the right shows where it puts its egg if there's water in the cell. So she can plan for whether it's a wet day or not. So, okay, there's some diversity in the larvae. They all look like little white glistening worms to most people. Bill Stevens dug a lot of them up and drew them. A lot of people have. And you can see some differences there after the person looks at them under a microscope and pulls those differences out for you. So they're diverse, they're different, but not much. There is an exception to that, a sinister exception. So I was up at Bake Stewart Park at the head of Dorina on the 2nd, I think, of April, and the baby blue eyes, which aren't blue here, the Nemophilas, were swarming with these little Andrenas, these little spring bees. And, that's Nemophila menziesii, or no, Nemophila menziesii, variety Adameria, which is the baby blue eyes that is not blue. It's one of my favorites. And there are Andrenas. In California, there are several of these bee species that specialize just on this genus of flowers. I've been hoping to prove that we have some specialists as well. What I noticed was, in a half an hour of seeing maybe 20 or so of these Andrenas, I saw 20 or so of these Nomadas, which are also a bee, but they're one of the genera that doesn't think that it's worth it to gather its own pollen. So they're called kleptoparasites or inquilines. They sneak around and lay their eggs in other bees' nests. And so, okay. So there are a few tricks that these cuckoo bees have learned over the years, over the decades, over the millennia, to fool or improve their success at being a cuckoo. Nomada is an interesting chemical example. There are studies that show that the host andrina, the host mining bee, digger bee? The host andrina secretes a certain scent in its Dufour's gland. Dufour, that sounds elegant, doesn't it? It's not Dufour's gland. A certain scent, and that we know that's the chemical that has been, that it's characterized. It's an exact chemical for an exact species. The nomada that parasitizes it, exact chemical as its host. The male's Dufour gland secretes, say, the geraniol or the aldehyde or whatever it is that the female andrina secretes to recognize its conspecific nest. The male transfers that chemical to the female nomada so she can sneak in and lay eggs in the host nest without getting caught. So there are inquilines or kleptoparasites of our leafcutter bees and some of our burrowing bees, and these are diagrams of where and how they lay their eggs. They'll lay the eggs sort of halfway through the wall of the host. And our Triapiolus and our Epiolus species, which are in the apid family, oh, he's sleeping. These guys are pretty generalist. They'll attack almost any family of bees in their range as far as their laying their eggs in someone else's nest. And I'm not aware that there's a chemical disguise, but after the littlest worm larva passes through a couple of stages, they bite. So after the second instar, Triapiolus larvae get big mandibles and they go find the host bee larva and they kill it. So there you go. Look, there's 3 little eyes on top of the head. So the compound eyes are two eyes. Then the little ocelli are 3 eyes on top of the head of every bee. There are bees that fly at dusk where the ocelli get huge. The specialists on evening primroses in the southwest, gigantic ocelli. Okay. This is Astellas. She is in the megachilid family, in the leafcutter bee family. She's a nest parasite, as are the Coleoxys. And the Coleoxys have mandibles. Okay, there's the sinister bit. I think that's my time or so. So we'll move on to, there's our Anthophora bomboides again. She's sleeping, and it's time to say goodnight.
I have a question for you. I used to live in Southern California. As I was really young, going to grade school, we used to have, of course, what a kid called sand bees that made their nests in the sand. Do you know what kind those are, and do they occur here too?
So the question is, in Southern California, the kids noticed sand bees that made their burrows in sand. And do we have them here? Most likely, I've seen accounts of nesting huge California nesting aggregations of bees of this Anthophora genus in sand in Southern California. So most likely, we have some relatives here.
I've heard that wood chips are bad for ground nesting bees, like if you put wood chips in your yard.
Are wood chips bad for ground nesting bees? Their ground is good for ground nesting bees. So this stands to reason. Right, maybe some hard packed ground that playground. In Portland, a school has adopted a colony of andrena that are burrowing in their playground. They have made them tickle bees because they don't sting, and they make sure that there's good bare ground for the andrena bees.
That's why it's called the sand bee.
Really?
How deep are the nests that they fill in the ground?
It can be pretty deep. I mean, decimeters, better, more. So they work at them all season. Some of them, of the colonial or semi-social ones, work at them all season. At my work, we put prescribed grass fires over colonies. It doesn't get hot. They're deep enough that it doesn't get so hot that it kills them.
Of all the insects, how much is the percentage of these guys?
Unmeasurable. There's so many flies and beetles. It might as well be undefined. If there's 20,000 species in the world, how many million fly and beetle species are there?
I just didn't know the role they play.
All the pollen that gets moved by animals, they're the best. Alice?
The bees that are being parasitized, do they have the against the chemicals?
So do the victims of these kleptoparasites have defenses? Well, at least one, which is stay in the nest and guard it. So if they're not busy foraging, a lot of times you'll see their faces right there. Like, come on, come on.
Oh, I agree.
So, you know, I brought some books. Some of them are just to demonstrate how dang many of bees there are and how dang hard it is to identify them. There are a few that are like how to manage pollinators. There's one beautiful picture book to look through.
And the bees.
This one is why I'm not a bee taxonomist. This is all of a certain subgenus of 4 millimeter bees in Canada. But if you look through it, you'll see the work that goes into something like that. Yes?
How many of these bees that you're mentioning of all the different kinds have stingers? Or sting
How
problems?
many have stingers? Well, so we define bees as aculeate hymenoptera that live on pollen. And the aculeate hymenoptera are those bees, wasp and ants, or bees, wasp and ants. They have stingers. So half of them, the females. How many use them? You have to get pretty rough with most of these bees before they'll give you a jab.
Species, the females, all species have stingers.
Just picking up the real thing.
And some dead bees for you to cuddle, or I mean, look at and see kind of some of the family diversity if you really want to. A little collection. Yes.
You said there were 8 species of bees in the world that were listed on the endangered species list, and 7 of those are in Hawaii. Is that correct?
So 8 species of bees in the United States that are on the U.S. Federal Endangered Species List. 7 are in Hawaii. That is correct.
And one is in the
One is the rusty patch bumblebee that was just listed a few months ago. There's a great film you can probably see online called Ghost in the Making by Clay Bolt, which talks about the decline of that bee.
I can't hear you. What bee was it?
The rusty patch bumblebee.
Burleigh Town.
So look up Clay Bolt and the Ghost in the Making. There's a kind of a nice little film about the decline of the rusty patch. And that's the sister species of our western bumblebee that I mentioned is now functionally extinct. I think it's been petitioned for listing as well, and it should, you know, to the extent that being on the endangered species list helps, it would be.
So are the parasitic bees, are they increasing or decreasing? The ones that eat the underwater?
So you'll hear some, if you really work at it, you can find some people saying a lot of bees are going extinct and pretend to be credible. But it's really hard to measure bee populations, these native bee populations. Nobody really knows how to do it. I mean, the fellow that takes the pictures of the with black background, the really good pictures, that book over there, his lab is dedicated to figuring out how we can monitor and understand the way bee populations go. Nobody can say for sure, except in a few cases like the bumblebees where it's pretty obvious based on collection rates and things like that.
Do small bees tend to work small flowers and big bees big flowers?
Do small bees work small flowers and big bees work big flowers? No. Small bees might not be very effective pollinators of big flowers, but they might still get a benefit. And so they wouldn't leave them alone. And then big flowers, you know, again, it's an effective pollination question. Maybe big bees are better. Or maybe they're hard to work, like a lupin flower or a pea flower. You really have to grab that thing and give it a twist to get it to shoot its pollen out. So bumblebees are best at that. Or tomatoes, you have to be able to sonicate or buzz, and so or cranberries, so only bumblebees and a few other genera, not honeybees, can do that buzz pollination and shake the pollen loose. So it has a lot more to do with shape and function than it does with size.
Question to you.
Yeah, I have a question about
Sure.
the expression flying in a bee line, typically with, say, the bumblebees, one you're talking about. When one would say flying in a bee line, how far in a straight direction would a bee typically fly on its way back through the hive after being fully laid with pollen? And then what is the horizontal speed of flight typically?
So, given the expression flying a beeline or flying in a beeline, how far does a bee fly straight back to its nest? What's the kind of
Right.
range? And then what's the speed?
Yes.
I can answer the speed question very easily. I don't know.
Honeybees will go for 5
So, the distance, people study this. They talk about the distance that a bee can fly. And actually, there are indices that have been built that are based on the width of the thorax between the wings. So the wider the thorax is, the bigger the bee is, the farther it can fly. And bumblebees will fly a couple miles to forage. Smaller bees, less distances.
And then one more question. How is predation from birds typically during daylight hours? Are there species of birds that specialize in bees?
Are there species of birds that specialize in bees? What's the predation rate? In Oregon, I do not know. There are bee eaters on other continents.
Blue jays live for queen honeybees.
What are some of the best ways to encourage more native species of bees in my garden?
So encouraging native bee species in your garden, which is the subject of a whole another hour. And wasn't this talk because biodiversity is cool. Native flowers, lots of them in big masses that bloom throughout the season, nesting substrates, bare ground, sand, dead stems, and holes in wood. And then managing native pollinator book. You can get it from Xerces or look at it right here. Or if you're more concerned about alternative crop pollination, managing alternative pollinators for crops, which you can get Xerces. Something. It's here to look at. Yes.
Real quickly here, for people who want to winter in Arizona, winters that kill bees hear about because they've been there long enough now. They're pretty well integrated with honeybees. So what I understand, honeybees in Arizona, they just make that honeybees a little bit more aggressive.
Along with California too.
Yes, there are Africanized honeybees in the southern U.S.
I think he's asking are they dangerous?
They've killed people recently.
Yeah, you're not going to get them up here too far north.
Maybe.
Far north.
For now.
ecosystem was evolving.
Oh, is there anybody who wants to finish off a trivia question that we didn't cover? What? Which one? I mean, did you miss a question and you don't understand why? I covered that. I just covered that for an hour.
Hey, Wes, I'm curious about the engine on the wings. Is that because they hover, they're little balls?
I don't know.